I spoke before the Western Resources Corporation Group in Grand Bahamas recently and met a most interesting gentleman. I met many interesting people there, and I found Buzz Arndt, the Vice President and Director of Marketing, particularly interesting. He recommended that I read a book with the ridiculous title, Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown by Alan Watts, which I promptly ordered and put in my briefcase for reading. It's a good book. I have since also obtained a copy of Alan Watts' autobiography, entitled In My Own Way. Alan Watts died in February '74 after having lived a most interesting life and having written some 20 books. His books are considered the most penetrating and above all readable interpretations of Eastern religions. Although he did not restrict himself to writing about Eastern religions, he created the Zen boom in America and has been popular on college campuses from one end of the country to the other. If you haven't become acquainted with Watts' writings, I think you'll find them interesting and beneficial. I found his discussion of the Chinese Taoism of particular interest. Now, that's spelled Taoism and often mispronounced Taoism. Taoism. The Tao signifies the energy of the universe as a way, a current, a course, or flow which is at once intelligent and spontaneous, but not personal like a Western god. It would be absurd to worship or pray to the Tao because it's your own true self, the very energy and patterning of your bones, muscles, and nerves. Lao Tzu's first statement about it is that it cannot be defined, for the simple reason that you cannot make what is basically you and basically real an object of knowledge. You can't stand aside from it and examine it as something out there. Although then we cannot define it, we must not assume that it is something bleary like the blind energy of 19th century scientists. From our own point of view, our heads themselves are blind spots. But were it otherwise, we should be looking only at neurons and dendrites and would never see mountains and trees. But of course, when neurons and dendrites are seen from the inside, they become mountains and trees. Yet although Tao cannot be examined and pinned down, it has a characteristic atmosphere which may be sensed in the lifestyles of various Far Eastern poets, artists, and sages, and which is indicated by the term Feng Liu in Chinese and Furyu in Japanese, which means something like flowing with or following with the wind. It's also translated as elegance, which is not quite right because in English an elegant person is refined and fussy and perpetrates an atmosphere of haughty disdain. Whereas the Chinese poet is sometimes amiably drunken, wandering aimlessly in the mountains, and laughing at falling leaves. One gathers that this sort of person is no longer allowed in China. But he's typified by Putai, the fat, laughing tramp Buddha who carries a gnarled staff and a huge bag of interesting rubbish which he gives away to children. Frederick Spiegelberg, the philosopher and Orientalist, visited a Taoist hermit like Putai on an island near Hong Kong. When he was introduced as an American university professor traveling under a Rockefeller grant to find out whether Asian spirituality was still vital, the hermit began to chuckle very gently, and this gradually developed into uproarious laughter, at which his whole glutinous mass shook like jelly, and that was the end of the interview. A more ancient Taoist sage, whose name I forget, was approached by a Chinese emperor one time to be an advisor to the government. He declined the offer with extreme courtesy, but when the emissary had departed, he washed out his ears, and also those of the donkey on which he customarily rode. Then there was the Chinese Zen priest, famed as a great painter, but who, unlike other priests, grew his hair long. After getting sufficiently drunk, he would dip his hair into a bowl of ink and then slosh it over a scroll of paper. The next day he'd give himself a Rorschach test on the splosh and see in it images of mountains, rivers, and forests, which needed only a few touches of the brush to bring them out for all to see. When I was invited to the tea ceremony by the artist and printmaker Saburo Hasegawa, he pointed out the subtle beauty of cigarette ash on a tile made by J.B. Blunk, which we were using for an ashtray. Now, these are vignettes to give you some suggestion of the atmosphere of flowing with the Tao. The principle of the thing is also recognized by our own surf riders, some of whom know very well that their sport is a form of yoga or Taoist meditation in which the whole art is to generate immense energy from going with your environment, from the principle of wu-wei, or following the gravity of water, and so making yourself one with it. For as Lao Tzu himself said, gravity is the root of lightness. Now, using this ancient Chinese principle, we learn the senselessness of trying to force our way upstream against the current. Flow with the river, It's another way of saying achieve serenity, or as we say today, or did at least, cool it. Get rid of tension and rigidity. Bend with the wind, and you'll still be around after the hurricane is gone and the good weather returns. It's like the principle of judo, which uses the power and force of your aggressor to defeat him. He makes the move. You simply channel him, using his own force and momentum to easily cause him to sprawl in the dirt. The same thing with the feeling of Taoism. It can be done to trouble, worries, situations which at first seem threatening, but which can, if we flow with the river, be turned to our advantage. A person with such an attitude and philosophy cannot be defeated. He smiles with the wisdom of understanding. He knows that he himself is a part of everything else, the very energy of the universe, and that he can best live and achieve whatever ends he decides upon by going with the wind, with the current, with ease and serenity, never with tension, never with force or strain. In the Western world, we've become used to such terms as the rat race, fighting the competition, getting our share of the market. A world in which tension and strain concerned expressions are everyday things. We consume tons of tranquilizers to attempt to achieve the very thing that Taoism teaches. In sailing a boat, the force of the wind is used to sail to all points of the compass. With the same wind, we can go north or south, east or west. It all depends upon our attitude, the way we set our sails and proceed. Now, we cannot sail directly into the wind, but we can tack and arrive in good time. Now, we know the maximum speed of a sailboat by a simple formula. It's the square root of the length of the waterline. There's little use in trying to go much faster. If you're cruising in a sailboat, you shouldn't be in a hurry anyway. Alan Watts speaks of the energy of the universe. We can think of the energy of the universe as we think of the wind when sailing. The energy flows. We don't know what it is or where it comes from. We don't need to define it or try to bottle it up. It's there. It's available to us if we're wise enough to use it. We have only to set our course, stay at the helm of our lives, go with the wind and the current, and we'll arrive at our destination in good time, without tension, without worry or strain, or a coronary or an ulcer. What's more exhilarating, for example, than surf riding? Yet we're following the flow of the waves, going with the current, allowing ourselves to be swept along at great speed. Our job is one of skill and balance, learning to manipulate the surfboard. We can learn to sail a boat or ride a surfboard, and we can become expert at whatever we choose to do with our lives. Then we must learn to flow with the current, with the energy of the universe, and it'll bring us anything we seek. It's good to dwell on this ancient Chinese philosophy when driving in traffic, playing golf or tennis, sailing, skiing, selling, working, getting along with our families. It's a good way to go. Flow with the current, ride with the wind. Just keep the skills improving and a steady hand on the wheel and an eye on the sails. Don't push. Don't sweat and strain. Keep your blood pressure down. Move with the traffic. Relax. You'll get there just as fast and without the frayed nerves and dents. Remember, we're not here all that long. Let's enjoy the trip. On a speaking trip to Los Angeles recently, I ran into an old acquaintance, John Hartman, who reminded me of something we should all remain aware of, but which we tend to forget. He said, those of us who travel around the country a lot and get to see the United States from all different perspectives are aware of the tremendous value and potential we have here. We have a truly great product, and we tend to forget it. Well, he's most certainly right. Of all the Western countries, prosperous as they have become, and let's include Japan in the East, not one of them has the resources to be found in such abundant supply in the United States. Canada has the natural resources, but lacks the people. Japan has the people, but lacks the natural resources. And the countries of Europe, including the British Isles, are greatly dependent upon the rest of the world for their economic survival. We have the land mass, the size we need, a perfect climate for living and producing, enormous natural resources, and the people and the technological skills to do the rest. John was right. A trip around the country with one's eyes open is tremendously rewarding and impressive. It makes you realize that we're just getting started. After reading Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown by Alan Watts, I ordered some of his other books, and on my recent flying trip to the West Coast, I read his The Wisdom of Insecurity. I think it bogs down some toward the end of the book, but he makes a couple of points in the beginning which make the book an excellent investment. One of them is that security and safety do not exist during our life on Earth. Looking for security or safety is like trying to hold your breath for 10 minutes. It's an impossible quest. But that impossible quest is what keeps so many millions living in a state of strained tension and running as fast as they can from month to month trying to lay hold of a phantom. We are completely secure in the universe. We're as secure in our atomic structure as anything else, a rock or a gas. As the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun has said, as far as living energy is concerned, there can be no death. But during our lives as we know them, the search for security and safety is patently ridiculous. And the best thing we can do in our quest for freedom is to get rid of these myths once and for all. In doing so, we'll know a wonderful new feeling of ease and freedom. It's like taking a deep breath and letting it out with a rush. The other day, a car came speeding through the busy intersection on one corner of which stands the building in which I have my office. He tried to beat the light, failed to do so, and was rammed in the middle of the intersection by a car proceeding on the green. He didn't have his seatbelt fastened, and the jolt of the other car hitting him amidships threw him across the seat to the other side of the car. Then, at high speed, with no one at the wheel, his car rammed into our building, knocking quite a hole in our decorative marble and doing extensive damage to the car. Well, it was fortunate that there were no pedestrians on the sidewalk at that time. Normally, there would have been at that time of day. 3 or 4 people could easily have been killed or seriously maimed. I could have been. There's not a moment of the day or night in which any one of us could not be brought to a sudden end as far as this life is concerned. Therefore, there is no safety. Howard Hughes, hiding in his penthouse, could die of a heart attack or stroke at any time. This fact rules out security and safety. They do not exist on Earth, and the best thing we can do is forget about them and revel in the new freedom, the new release from phony bondage that being concerned about these ancient bugaboos brings about. In our society, the chances are good that any one of us will live a long and normal lifespan. It's the mark of intelligence to plan for such a life and to make every reasonable effort to succeed in the 3 major departments of our lives, in our family lives, in the way in which we spend our days, and to provide for sufficient income to meet our present and future needs. But other than that, we should eliminate all concerns about trying to play it too safely. Now, I like to sail, as I mentioned. When I'm sailing alone, I wear a safety harness at all times. As I move about the boat adjusting the sails, I have my harness snapped to something on the boat so that should I fall or be knocked over the side, I won't find myself treading water and watching my boat sail over the horizon. That's simply good judgment. Accidents and injuries are 60% more likely to the person who doesn't use his automobile seatbelt. Using one is a sign of intelligent judgment, as is locking the doors of our homes when we turn in for the night. The man who ran the red light and rammed our building was a fool, and he's paying for his immaturity. Now, we've all made silly, unnecessary blunders, and we should avoid them whenever possible. To forget about security and safety does not imply the rejection of good judgment. What it does imply is a mature and realistic rejection of factors which, as they are pursued by most of us, simply do not exist. And we move toward freedom when we put them where they belong. I was reminded in Manas that Gandhi proclaimed 2 values as ultimate: Satya and Ahimsa, which mean truth and nonviolence. And these could be invoked by every individual in every situation. Like the Stoics, he believed that the good man will not live in solitude as a hermit, for he's naturally sociable and active. Virtue is a disposition or capacity of the ruling principle of the soul, assured and unchanging, worthy of choice for its own intrinsic quality, virtue, and its exercise is a continuous activity. That is, never interrupted by lapses and omissions, because it can never be lost. The appeal to intrinsic eternal values could be used to reject conservative as well as meliorist creeds that justify the present by appeal to the past or the future, and also the means employed by the distant ends they're supposed to serve. To Gandhi, it is necessary to do what seems to be right in scorn of consequences, and every single act must be justified in terms of the ultimate, unchanging values rather than the results that are expected to emerge. Now, this is excellent advice in the search for maturity and freedom. When problem situations arise, we know intuitively. Our bodies tell us what's right. But in a flash, expediency, or the supposed end toward which we're working, fills our minds, and selfishly we become cowards or willful children when we could have been great. If you'd like to know more about Mohandas Gandhi and his thought in relation to the central religious and philosophical ideas of both East and West, read the book, The Moral and Political Thought of Mahatma Gandhi, by Raghavan Iyer, professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, California. It's published by the Oxford University Press in New York. It is perhaps particularly apropos that as many people as possible, particularly those who hold or seek political office, read the second chapter, which is titled The Purification of Politics. Gandhi, as Manas points out, is too casually called a politician. He was the most unusual politician in that he believed that the high standards of individual morality ought to have application in politics, and that reason of state could never justify compromise or neglect of moral principles. He saw no distinction, finally, between the good of the individual and the good of society, and while he was not unaware of the slow rate of development of man in the mass, he felt that progress toward a social ideal would be not merely slowed further, but actually prevented by failing to work toward wholly worthy goals. He thought of politics as a practical application of religion, and religion for him lay in religious values rather than in religious beliefs, with the fundamental ethics that he believed to be common with all religions, rather than the formal allegiance to received dogmas that become a barrier to religious experience. Daniel Long, author of the book Of Bombs and Men and Staying Alive, published some years back by McGraw-Hill, once went to Washington with his notebook in his hand to find out when enough is enough. As a model of frustration, his account is unequaled. His question was simplicity itself. Since we already have thousands of nuclear weapons, when will we have enough? Trudging through a maze of government, he asked that question of generals and scientists, diplomats and congressmen. The more people he talked to, the more apparent it became that within the government itself, tentativeness was everywhere. He discovered that nobody would tell him, not because they didn't want to, and not because it was a military secret, but simply because nobody knew. Wandering the capital in search of answers, he grew accustomed to hearing earnest answers that were charged with dilemma and paradox, with fact shaped by opinion, with logic rooted in prayer. To the self-contained world of official Washington, it seemed an unfair question. It was like asking how far is up, to which the only answer is, as far as you want to go. But since nobody was quite sure where we were going, nobody could tell Mr. Lang when we would get there, or indeed if we'd already arrived. Like Diogenes with a notebook, he persisted in his quest with the tenacity of a skilled reporter and the concern of a deeply troubled citizen. Although it produces no solutions, his inquiry into enoughness provides a vivid and troubling portrait of the nuclear confusion we live in. As Ronald Steele wrote in his review of Lang's book, it is one of the paradoxes of our times that the weapons on which our safety presumably depends are designed for the purpose of making their use unnecessary. They are not meant to fight a war which could only result in the destruction of much of Western civilization, if not all of it, but to prevent a war from occurring. The old concept of victory, like a good many other ideas inherited from pre-Hiroshima days, has given way to the concept of deterrence, and in defining what constitutes an adequate deterrent, all is truly dilemma and paradox. The then Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said that enough equals the amount required to deter an enemy strike, plus the amount needed to minimize damage to this country in the event of a strike. But what will deter an enemy strike? He answered, unacceptable damage from our surviving forces. And what is unacceptable damage? 20 million dead? 50 million? 150 million? Well, here all rational speculation ceases. All we know, or at least all we think we know, is that deterrence means there shall be no aggression without retaliation. But what constitutes an adequate deterrent is anybody's guess. Deterrence is not a science, it's an exercise in political psychology. And the fact that millions of human beings must live this way is, as one official put it, a hell of a way to run a railroad. On her deathbed, Gertrude Stein is said to have asked the question, what is the answer? And a few moments later, she answered herself by asking, what is the question? If you've ever had the urge to write, a book that will get you started and perhaps even keep you going is, well, wait a minute. I'll give you the title of the book in a moment. But first, did you ever hear of a man named Frederick Faust? He was probably the most prolific writer who ever lived. During his career as an author, Faust turned out an estimated 30 million words from his typewriter. Now, that's the equivalent of more than 500 average-sized novels. If you've ever done much pecking on a typewriter, you have an idea of what 30 million words are. To give a personal comparison, I've been writing my daily radio program now for more than 14 years, 260 programs a year for more than 14 years. But even so, they total only about 2.25 million words, or the equivalent of about 22 full-size books. But for all his prodigious production, how many people know who Frederick Faust was? A handful. A fairer question would elicit a far greater response. Have you ever heard of Max Brand, one of Faust's many nom de plumes? Under the name of Max Brand, Faust created at least two lasting folk heroes, Destry, as in Destry Rides Again, and Dr. Kildare, plus thousands of other characters. His output was almost unbelievable. During one 13-day period in 1920, he wrote 190,000 words, 3 complete books in 13 days. Now that's a complete book every 4.5 days. He once produced an 8,000-word story in 6.5 hours. When he was working in Hollywood, he used to turn out finished screenplays in a week or two that took most screenwriters several months to complete. In the beginning, this great torrent of Faust prose was poured almost exclusively into the pulp magazines, so-called for their cheap paper and cheap fiction. Faust often had as many as 3 stories in a single issue of a magazine, each story appearing under a different name. Though he wrote mysteries, spy and adventure tales, and historical romances, Faust was primarily known for his westerns, and to one magazine alone, Western Story, which was a favorite of my father's, he contributed 307 stories, serials, and novelettes. Even though he loved to write of the West, he had little use for it as an experience. His publisher once sent him to El Paso, Texas, to soak up some real Western environment, and he spent the whole time in his hotel room reading Greek tragedies, which he read, incidentally, in the original Greek. Even though he later moved up to the higher quality fiction market, the so-called slicks, such as Liberty, Collier's, and the Saturday Evening Post, and became as prodigious a supplier to them as he had been to the pulps, he was at heart an intellectual and a classicist. In the early days, while working as a subway laborer and living in a Bowery YMCA in New York, he read Nietzsche, Darwin, Spencer, Kant, Dante, Homer, and the rest in their original languages. His familiarity with the Greek myths was often betrayed by the mythological threads he wove into his Western stories and by the godlike qualities he gave his cowboys. Oddly enough, he failed in his greatest literary attempt. He labored for 6 years on the opus dearest to his heart, an epic poem, Dionysius in the Underworld, only to have it universally rejected by publishers. He finally had to pay for its publication himself. So if you need inspiration to write, get the book Max Brand, The Big Westerner, a biography of Faust by Robert Easton, who calls him an unknown giant and puts him in the company of Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and Hemingway. I read an article by J.B. Priestley in which he pointed out that so much of our lives these days are characterized by the pervasive feeling that there ought to be something else. At the cocktail party, and especially afterwards, on Sunday afternoons and at odd times during our days, we're aware of a small voice telling us that something is missing from our lives. It might be said to be akin to the feeling we sometimes have when something we've wanted to do or a trip we've wanted to take is over and we're left in the vacuum between events. I think the lack of something else of which Priestley writes might be caused by the lack of an overall journey, which is more important to us than the short trips which go to make it up. If you've ever taken a long motor trip toward a final destination that you want very much to reach, a trip which took several days, you remember enjoying each day's drive. At the end of your driving day, you look forward to stopping for the night, a hot bath, a good dinner after a relaxing drink or two perhaps, then the comfort and satisfaction of a comfortable bed. At that time, all seems well with the world. It's been a good day's drive, but the final destination still lies ahead. There's another day's drive ahead tomorrow. It's the final destination which gives meaning to your days and your efforts, the long hours at the wheel in all sorts of weather and driving conditions. It wouldn't be at all the same if you just drove the same amount of time and distance aimlessly on highways around your home. It would be unbearably boring and frustrating, a terrible waste of time, effort, and fuel. I think the something else is the lack, in so many lives, of a major goal which gleams and beckons in the distance.